So how do we want to get started with this?
Probably just cut in right there with that question and tell people, welcome to the Right-Wing Psychedelia episode of the +3 podcast.
Sounds good. Yeah. So today we'll be talking about an article that was just released, open access on Frontiers.
In psychology.
Oh man, Frontiers in Psychology.
Frontiers in Fascism.
No, that's not it. Anyhow, we'll have a link to the full article, but we thought that since there was some interest in this, and that this is co-authored by myself and Dr. Neşe Devenot here, we would walk people through it.
Excellent. So what is this paper? Why did y'all write this? Why are we here talking about right-wing psychedelia yet again?
Well, it was sort of a long time coming. We have written several pieces on various aspects of right-wing use and interest in psychedelia, and Neşe's been thinking about some of this for a while and has produced some videos on our YouTube channel that is related to some of this.
Let's give the longer arc of art, because both you and I were kind of following the IDW intellectual dark web and figures like Jordan Peterson, and looking at sort of the sympathies and alliances that were forming between these kind of right-wing thinkers and the psychedelic world. And it was really you had really kicked off some of this conversation in the land of public discourse with your Float Right Wing and some of the other early pieces that came up on symposia, some of which we've discussed in earlier podcasts as well.
Right. And I mean, and that also, to be fair, we I was inspired by some of the work of Alan Piper, who we also interviewed on an earlier episode. But yeah, some further discussion had sort of bled out into other outlets, and so there was a broader conversation. But then we also had sort of events that unfolded on the national stage, and so when an opportunity to do sort of a more full account presented itself to us, it was invited by an editor at Frontiers, Michael Winkleman, who's an anthropologist, and to do a more formal scholastic treatment of this subject. Neşe and I got to work. And so this is us showing our work.
There was also the kind of synchronistic timing where that week that you got the invitation, I had reached out and said, you know what, I feel like this topic is rich enough and important enough that we might want to consider co-writing an article. And then you forwarded me the invitation a few days later and said, is this one of these synchronicities that you like to talk about? I was like, oh, this is great. So
it was good timing. Neşe and I had just said, we need to submit an article together on these topics. So and I think the opportunity presented itself.
A lot that's in this article is a synthesis and really a deep exploration of a lot of the conversations that we've been having on the team for a while. And you published Lucy in the Sky with Nazis back in February of 2020. So yeah.
And a lot of the kind of corporadelic stuff, which is towards the end of the paper, talking about the capitalist and corporate influences on the state of psychedelic medicalization, we heavily cite other people on the team and the work that's been done more broadly by symposia.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, and one of the funny things, I guess not funny, maybe ironic, about being in this position and thinking about that corporadelic interweaving is, going back to 2018 when I was challenging MAPS cozying up to Peter Thiel, all of the responses or the general response from the broader psychedelic community, or certainly from more entrenched institutional actors, was so dismissive. And then you fast forward to the January 6th, and you see like some of the clear intermingling of these, the corporate actors, the funders, the Rebecca Mercers, and Rebecca Mercer had been involved back in 2018 as well, right, with the MAPS donation. And so the way that was dismissed out of hand at the time, and now fast forward, and there's so much more to be said about what's gone down as far as those intersections.
Yeah, and we were also covering MAPS, cozying up to a lot of the right-wing figures and where they're the right-wing liaison. We were covering Matt Gaetz and them lobbying, and MAPS lobbying Matt Gaetz, well before all the shit with Matt Gaetz came out too. So
right. I would say, broadly speaking, though, in terms of what spawned a lot of this investigation was really, it wasn't necessarily just out of a fascination with the right wing. It was that, there are certain historical associations with sort of radical politics that I think have outsized like influence in terms of people's conceptions of what psychedelics are and what they do. And it seems like some of those like themes and assumptions had started to bleed out into published research, starting about 2017, and then a couple of them over the years. And so, specifically some of those are from Noor et al. and some things out of Robin Carhart Harris's lab, and a few others that bring up the topic of authoritarianism and environmentalism and liberalism as having been sort of increased through the usage of psychedelics in both naturalistic and clinical settings. And so these were claims that were broadly repeated by the researchers themselves, and then sort of recombined in the media to have its own narrative.
And that's sort of the superficial narrative that's just laying out there in the mainstream, that you take psychedelics, you're gonna turn into some countercultural or whatever. You're gonna
be more progressive.
You're going to tune yourself to have more progressive values. There's this auto-tuning effect of psychedelics to make you more progressive. And the paper is challenging that in a way that hasn't been done yet.
Yeah. And I mean, so we haven't even the title of the paper is Right-Wing Psychedelia Case Studies in Cultural Plasticity and Political Pluripotency. And
what does that mean?
It's a term that was invented actually in response to some of our earlier work by Eric Lonergan.
Well, it was a term that was circulating in other contexts. It wasn't created for that purpose. The concept of political pluripotency. Yeah, okay. It has I hadn't seen it in the context of psychedelics until that point.
Okay.
But it means the idea that there's no specific like directional outcome politically in terms of political belief, and that it can go in any direction depending on, contextual setting factors.
Did you coin cultural plasticity?
No. So that was from Nicholas Langlet, his earlier paper on right of psychedelia. But so we're kind of putting those concepts in conversation. So it's like due to the kind of differing cultural constructs and the kind of context that people are having experiences in, the outcomes can go in any kind of political direction, and there's not an inherent progressive or liberalizing bent.
Yeah, and for those who are sort of unaware of what pluripotency on its own means, it's referring to undifferentiated cells. A lot of times people call them stem cells, and totipotent actually means the ability of cells to be any cell line. Pluripotent means many cell lines, but perhaps not all. So being an immune cell, a bone cell, or a blood cell, for example,
or like meristematic cells.
In a plant context, yes.
Yes, I just wanted to give that.
Yeah.
So I mean, this is also
maybe you're.
Go ahead, Neşe.
Oh, sorry. Maybe you're right. Actually, that the combination of political and pluripotent hadn't come up. So I was just doing a Google search. So yeah.
My understanding
I'm not
is
100% sure, but
yeah. I mean, well, we cite Eric Lonergan, who's a neuroscience PhD candidate, and he had written a piece that was said psychedelics politically pluripotent for the Mind Foundation blog, and I liked it. He was talking about some of the conversation that had unfolded, at least in part due to our reporting, and some other researchers who we cite in this article, sort of grappling with the question of whether or not psychedelics have any specific directional effect on people's beliefs or political ideology. And so we just thought it was a good term, and so we use it. In any case, one of the things that sort of has come to our attention as we've had these conversations for almost 2 years now, is that a lot of people's reactions, both sort of in the comments and in general conversation around this, sort of evidence to us that there was sort of a lack of understanding of some basic terminology when it comes to ideology. When we're talking about politics, not everybody, if we're not all speaking the same language, it's very difficult to move conversations forward. If people don't have a common understanding of what authoritarianism is, if we don't, define our terms, it's difficult to be on the same page.
Yes.
I think the glossary is fantastic, by the way.
What's that?
I think the glossary is fantastic.
The glossary.
Right. Yeah.
And it's also worth pointing out, right, that this is the point where you get specifically in like online discussions. This is where people start piling on around what's in good faith, what's in bad faith. The terms you're using are supposedly meaningless. All the people with classical liberal in their bio start piling on to tell you what they really are.
Right, because that's an important point around the intellectual dark web, and like Jordan Peterson in particular, where if we say these are right-wing people, a lot of people come out in the comments and say, oh, they're not, they're classical liberal, et cetera, et cetera. But so we are very careful to define what we mean by right-wing, and a big part of that is this deference to authority and this emphasis on hierarchical social structures that you see amongst these figures.
Right. Yeah, and I'm curious,
go on.
Well, you also run in specifically my experience in psychedelic spaces has been a lot of cliches and sort of what would you call them? Like almost poetic responses rather than right wing, left wing are both on the same bird type stuff rather than an engagement with. So like, for example, like when y'all are talking about, or when we're discussing right and left wing, can you give us some sense of where we're coming from, right? Like this has historical,
right.
Like this is rooted in, yeah.
So, I mean, that's the thing is like, we do our best to sort of like use whatever scholastic skills we have between us to try and comb through the literature and say, well, what do these terms actually mean? How have they been used? How have they been confused over time? How does context change what people mean when they're talking about political ideology, and so, for instance, we're not going to go through everything. We do encourage people to read the paper, but, we talk a little bit about authoritarianism by, citing Hannah Arendt, who had written, extensively on the topic, and go through, what authoritarianism looks like today, globally and locally, and sort of how is it organized? And as far as we can tell, and people have commented on it, looks like parts of authoritarianism are a part of our biggest institutions, our military, our penal, our business, our health, scholastic, religious institutions. All of these things have certain hierarchical structure that rely on authority simply to function. And so, we go through sort of the evolution of some of these schools of thought, coming out of really like, how do we distribute power in society? There was a time when power was thought to be inherited from the divine right of kings. And so the alternatives to that kind of thinking, you had like liberalism, which came up when people who were essentially merchants had enough power to start questioning whether or not hereditary authority was the only seat of power, But the history of liberalism is this like sort of merchant class asserting individual rights, talking about concepts like liberty as being inherent.
A lot of that is the unearthing. I'm not going to get into this tangent, but a lot of that is unearthing like the works of Cicero, and the proliferation of republicanism and all that, and breaking away from the monarchy and everything like that.
Right. So, yeah, I mean, essentially, though, one of the things that we sort of boil down is that, like, in some ways we can think about ideology in terms of whether or not you believe in some kind of like aristocracy, or to what degree you think democratic processes should be brought into everyday life. So we go through and really try and look at what like liberalism is, which is fundamentally an ideology of capitalism. And then what Dave, you asked, what's the historical understanding of right wing and left wing? It goes back to the French Revolution, and like literally what wing of French Parliament people sat on dictated whether or not they were for or against like revolution. And the monarchists were on the right, and the revolutionaries were on the left.
So we're not talking ornithology.
No, I mean, those who want to sort of change the systems so much, or even to democratize the system so much as to, redistribute power and the means of production, like that is definitionally left wing. If that's not something that you or your party supports, or if you continue to support the ideology of liberalism, which includes what in America is called liberalism, but also conservative. Conservatism is an ideology of sort of liberalism with a capital L. So, in defining our terms, we're trying to make it clear both what the literature says about ideology, but also just, by defining those terms, if we're talking about changes that might be chemically or neurologically dictated, like, well, what would those changes look like?
Right. And just to emphasize like some of the confusion with US politics that makes it hard to talk about these topics is that both of the main political parties are on the right. They're, because of the Democrats' kind of association with maintaining the status quo of capitalism, they're a kind of hierarchy-based organization. So when we're talking about like leftist ideas or the left, we're not talking about the Democratic Party.
Right. And I mean, this is like well understood internationally. For instance, Noam Chomsky recently was remarking that like, the Christian Democrat Party, which is like a right-wing party in Germany, is essentially very similar policy-wise to what was advanced by Bernie Sanders. They are pro universal health care. They want maternity leave, but in Germany they're a center right party, and so we have to understand that there are two right-wing parties in the United States, if we're using these terms like correctly.
Yeah, and I don't want to get too far off topic, right? But like, there's also discussions historically of like why that's the case, and like questions about feudalism and sort of the notion of obligations to your peonage throughout Europe compared to the U.S., and looking at the sort of origins of settler colonialism and capitalism, and the notion that, like, you know, if you can't afford to live, you should just go die. But
Right.
I don't want to get too far down that
Well,
delightful rabbit hole.
One thing I do want to say is that, like, we get into greater depth, particularly in the sort of taxonomy of right wing ideologies and what underpins them in like specific ways, things like social dominance orientation, ultranationalism. What are these things? What officially is fascism? What is Nazism? What are those belief systems? What makes them unique? Where is their overlap? So we try and do our due diligence in defining those terms so that we can have a better conversation.
And it's also worth noting that, like, beyond like part of the reason due diligence is important, not just in sort of setting out operational definitions so that people understand, like, not only are there consensus like discussions about this or consensus definitions, but also when you're using the terms, defining them so that people can engage with you where you're at and as defined is important. It feels doubly important in this context because you have an issue with people masking their labels, or people using labels that signify one thing to their in-group, but another thing to people who are maybe not so familiar with this sort of political nomenclature. So I really appreciate y'all including that in there, in part because it allows you to diffuse some of that disingenuous rhetoric that seems to spring up around these topics.
Right. Like everything from like the OK symbol to drinking glasses of milk to, I think recently, like clown emojis, and honk honk has been like, code for Heil Hitler and such. So crypto-fascism's a thing. And, we point to other, people who've written and talked more extensively about these topics. But it's sort of akin to what Neşe was talking about earlier, with regard to classical liberals. Like, if you want to rebrand, your ideology, even though it's sort of got a bad reputation, you just call it something else. So we talked briefly about that.
Well, and that's precisely what Richard Spencer did with the alt-right, and then immediately, like he was credited with coining alt-right, and then it was not terribly long after that he was throwing Nazi salutes and chanting Heil Trump, which kind of blew his cover.
Right. But yeah, so I mean, then after we sort of got that out of the way, we start with some of our case studies. Essentially, we had people in the literature and in the media asserting that psychedelics were going to make people more liberal, more environmentalist, less authoritarian. And there were several studies that asserted this, some of which were sort of naturalistic surveys of people who'd taken a broad array of drugs, and they then sliced out those who had taken psychedelics and asked them about their relative authoritarian level using a 10-point questionnaire. Questionnaires are sort of the name of the game here in terms of like what does it mean when you go up or down on these scales. There's it's quantified in this way.
Before we get into that, can you just, in terms of definition and orientation, can you just explain a little bit about, in the context of the drug war and drug usage, the sort of differences between traditional conservatism and libertarianism? Because within the context of psychedelia, I think the predominant group tends to be people who self-identify as libertarian. Yeah, can you just give some orientation there?
Yeah, and thanks, because it's an important point. And I think there's a lot of folks out there who say, "Oh, well, I'm not right or left. I'm a libertarian." Or you also, we'll see the same sort of thing, like saying like I'm an anarchist or something, but to different effect. When it comes to libertarianism, though, like generally speaking, libertarianism is well, originally it was a term that actually just meant a socialist. Internationally, if you say you're a libertarian, a lot of people will understand that you're a socialist. But we go to the literature where it was sort of documented by one of the architects of the American libertarian project, which is much more associated with people like, Rand Paul today than it is anybody who, would like to provide socialized medicine for everyone. So there is a right and a left-wing libertarianism, just as there is right and left-wing authoritarianism. The focus of our paper is right-wing movements, though. And if we're talking right-wing libertarianism, that's mostly what we see in the United States. It's people like Joe Rogan, people who generally support private industry, who see no problem with corporate personhood and Supreme Court decisions like Citizens United that give the full individual rights to corporations, and so there's a lot of overlap and common cause between conservatives and right libertarians, although right libertarians are going to be why we see them in the drug reform movement so much is that, these are people who are like, keep your hands off of my individual liberties. I should be able to do what I want, live how I want without, the government regulating me or my commerce. And so you actually end up with, very laissez-faire capitalist policies being advanced by those who call themselves like libertarians in a U.S. context.
And this is the kind of particular strand of conservative who is pro-cannabis, pro-psychedelics, by and large,
By and large.
The overlap is there, obviously.
And in terms of the backing, like in the sort of the really existing libertarian party in the United States, Jane Mayer wrote a fantastic book called Dark Money that details the sort of the funding behind the Libertarian Party way back when. That a lot of which comes from the Koch family. And these people were originally the funders of the John Birch Society, extremely right-wing conspiratorial, Cold War era group, and then the sons, the Koch brothers, as they came to be known, decided that was a little too extreme for them, and they started funding the Libertarian Party. Like I think David Koch actually ran for president, or thought about running. Did he run for president? I think he ran for president under the Libertarian ticket at one point. So. And
this kind of contrasts with the traditional conservative just say no approach to drugs, the more moral approach to drug use, more prohibitionary. It's funny because like when we look at psychedelia now, we see a lot of the right libertarian approach, and a lot of this is through the effort of lobbying just various. Like
the Cato Institute, for instance, is extremely funded by the Koch Koch Industries and their affiliated charities. I remember seeing a Cato Institute fellow speak way back like 20 years ago, and I asked him about how he felt about the free market and currently scheduled illegal drugs, and he said he was for it. He thought it would be a good thing. You look at like Glenn Greenwald, for instance, actually did a very thorough study of the decriminalization policies of Portugal, and it was funded by the Cato Institute. So, all right. But yeah, lot of libertarians at Burning Man. Too long, didn't read it. So I mean, moving on, like we basically just sort of get into the fact that there are a lot of these different case studies that demonstrate that there are people who have had extensive experience with psychedelics, and then later became right-wing extremists or right-wing extremists who had experiences with psychedelics, and they remained so.
Do you want to just give like a few examples, like not in depth, because I think we have a lot to cover, but just like a few of the ones in the paper
Yeah, and I mean, we have to sort of be careful not to try and replicate the entire paper. We do want people to read it, but there's a number of cases, some of which were cited by like Alan Piper. So anybody interested, I encourage you to check out that interview that we did with them. But sort of in more recent times, you have.
I don't think we should focus on the recent times. I think the younger example, the Hoffman younger example, I think is a good place to kind of point that out in the word psychonaut, and I think that's a fascinating tidbit.
Well, some of this we've talked about in previous episodes, but like Albert Hoffman, turned to Ernst Jünger when he was exploring LSD. To be his tripping buddy because he admired Ernst Jünger as a literary figure. He wrote things like, Storm of Swords,
Steel.
A Storm of Steel, thank you. And, several other, he's sort of renowned in the German literary world. He was a World War I hero. But
and these are like accounts of warfare, right? Like these are like battlefield accounts of like, quote unquote heroism and violence and, national. Yeah.
Right. So Jünger was he was a supporter of the, of the aims of Hitler until 1939, till Kristallnacht,
He was also a champion of the monarchy that had fallen, anti-Republican, anti-democracy.
Right. So, I mean, there's scholars of Jünger have a lot of debate about, what he really felt, but like what he actually did was serve as a Wehrmacht officer in occupied France. He was a captain and a censor for the Nazis, but he also coined the term psychonaut while describing the work of Arthur Hefter, who did a lot of pioneering work on mescaline. So he was somebody who tripped with Hoffman. Hoffman devotes an entire chapter of his autobiography, LSD, My Problem Child, to Jünger. And there is a sort of there's a thread of psychedelia that looks to this close association between Jünger and Hoffman as sort of like as their lineage. And Alan Piper did a great job of demonstrating how that threads down. So we touch a little bit on that in the paper, where people who are interested in the works of Jünger are today associated with modern Nazi and fascist movements.
Yeah, and just want to point out about Jünger is that when the Allies took over, he was kind of blacklisted. He was censored. He had to go into a period of relying on a network of allies to support him, because the Allies identified him as pretty much a dangerous individual and influential.
Yeah, he refused the denazification process, and he was deemed as a sort of a particular term, which is that he was a fellow traveler of the Nazis.
And during the period of denazification is when he connected with Albert Hoffman, who was sending him financial support as well. I just want to point out there is an excellent paper. If anyone's interested in Jünger, there's an excellent paper. I'm probably gonna not pronounce his name right, but it's from 2008 by Thomas Hodges. It's called it's a master's thesis from the University of Durham.
Oh, right.
It's called With a Little Help
great.
from My Friends, Ernst Jünger and His Network in the Post-War Period. And it's a really detailed look of Jünger that I thought was a really phenomenal paper.
Right.
Should throw that up in the notes section.
Sure.
But yeah, just moving forward, there like the reality is that the first people to experiment with LSD in the United States were members of the CIA. These are not peaceniks, and through all of their antics and working with the upper echelons of government, we see no evidence that these people became more liberal or less authoritarian. Coming up closer to the present day. We have neo-Nazis who are actively organizing for violence, having involvement or use or condoning the use of psychedelics. People from the base who were organizing for violence and busted on weapons charges, but found to have been manufacturing or attempting to manufacture DMT, but also using LSD in sort of group male bonding rituals. There's a lot of paganism and occult threads to modern fascist movements, and so that sort of ritual magic side of it was tapped. There's a bunch of darker threads that we didn't actually end up weaving into the paper, but that's a rabbit hole of its own. But I mean, in a more sort of out front and public kind of facing version of the modern right movement, you have Gavin McInnes, who was a co-founder of Vice magazine, and then evolved to be the founder of the Proud Boys, who are causing havoc in cities across America today. They're a violent gang. The FBI considers them a hate group or a terrorist organization. But Gavin McInnes is on record not just with his own psychedelic experiences, but Neşe, you found you want to describe the video that you directed our readers to?
Yeah, it was on his podcast or radio show.
It is a podcast.
Yep.
Yeah, and he's basically like giving tips on how to approach psychedelic experience for his listeners and his viewership. So like recommending it for his listeners.
Well, and specifically like what
how
to do,
metabolize bad trips.
Yeah.
Right. Like how to ride them out, and you're going to be okay.
Challenging experiences, Dave. How dare you?
So sorry. So sorry. Yeah, I mean that level of and you could say it's not like super deep, but it's still, when you're getting into sort of the I don't know what you want to call it, operations manual, or like, how to navigate some of these spaces, or the notion of like, it's not just discussion of these things as available experiences or drugs that people can try, but then sort of engaging in discussion of like best practices, quote unquote, for approaching them, right? Like there is an implicit promotion, right? Like the notion that these things have value, and I think this actually touches on like one of my I don't know, dead horses to beat, which is that like I think a lot of people understand that psychedelic experiences offer the potential for like political realizations, and this goes back to your concept of political pluripotency, but this notion that like the realizations you have about yourself, about society, about the world at large have political implications, and there's not necessarily a directionality as far as how you make meaning and put into action the realization that everything is interconnected and that you have some role to play in that, let's say. But at the point where you've got Gavin McInnes or the base or whomever saying like, there's enough merit to these experiences from our political worldview that we are going to extract DMT, that we are going to engage in telling our audiences about how to navigate difficult experiences, right? Like there is an implicit understanding in that engagement that there's something worth doing here.
Mm-hmm.
I find it fascinating that in 2021 you have to kind of spell this out, make this explicit again, that psychedelics are non-specific amplifiers. This shouldn't be a surprising. This should not be surprising at all.
I just want to interrupt you for a moment. Sorry for the excitement, because even the notion of psychedelics as non-specific amplifiers, that comes from Groff. nobody is talking about like there are almost no references to the fact that Groff's LSD research was made possible by the Czech secret police. Like, and there's language barriers to doing that research. And I have a couple academics that I've had on my list of folks to contact who may have more insight into this. But the people I've spoken to around Groff's background, the response is, oh, but that's how all the research was done at that time. And it's like, yes, that is how all the research was done at that time. Let's look into what the fuck the CIA did, like the notion that you had to work with the Czech secret police and in that moment in history in order to do this kind of research doesn't explain away or dismiss or nicely wrap everything up. It actually presents, like, to my mind, a very clear avenue for exploration that seems to be incredibly underexplored.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, along those lines, there's so much that we just don't know because of the dearth of documentation that was intentionally destroyed. There has been some more like research and interest in this area, and I hope more can be uncovered. But I think that for me, I think probably for all of us, but like the idea that we do have this history where institutions had a lot of power over, the research involved with psychedelics in the very early phases before all of this 1960s, that is in everybody's popular conception of psychedelics, that people who were incarcerated, wards of the state in mental institutions had more psychedelic experience, and CIA agents themselves, military personnel, had more psychedelic experiences than any beat poet at that time. We have very little knowledge of this, the real lived stories, and what we do know of is extremely harrowing. And here we are revisiting, this topic, and the same players are being tapped for funding, for directing the research. And it's one thing if we say, well, we've learned thoroughly from these activities, and we've set up new protocols to sort of never again this situation. And yet there are, as Naomi Klein and others have pointed to, there are pretty clear connections and lines of like a lineage that connects MK Ultra through the work of DU and Cameron and psychic driving to the modern day CIA black site and Guantanamo Bay and all the sensory deprivation and things that we see there. So
it's
sort
also
of
an area. The 60s CIA, MK Ultra, authoritarian psychedelic torture back then is also, it's so discouraged now as well in the push to.
You mean the topic?
Yeah, I think it's very discouraged, and then it also has the air for people who could be interested in it. It also has the air of conspiracy when you start talking about the CIA, and that repelled me for a minute. I would encourage anybody
to read Acid Dreams.
Yeah, read Acid Dreams. I mean, I think Acid Dreams was published in 85.
85. It was 85. Yeah.
A 36-year-old book reading today is incredibly relevant, which is kind of crazy.
Well, and the other thing is, even now as this stuff is getting covered, like, Poisoner in Chief came out recently, which is about, and looking at the way that some of that was covered in the media, somebody did I forget which company did a podcast called Midnight Climax that was a discussion, basically a narrative, a rundown of that sub project, and the way that they decided to produce that podcast, it's all overdone. It's like, it's very campy, like 1930s, 1940s radio drama style voices. And when you listen to it, it sounds fictional, right? Like it's so overdone that like it almost loses the sense of historical atrocities carried out in the name and in the interest of the state. And like I listened because I was curious to hear what they'd cover and if they went beyond the things in Poisoner in Chief. And I have to say, like, I think they did a disservice precisely because like these are real stories that are so frequently treated as conspiracy theory, even though there's extensive documentation, there's verification, validation. Like this is real shit that needs to be discussed because it has significance historically and in the present moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, with regard to the present moment, we have a rise of right-wing paramilitaries, extremists, people organizing for insurrection, militia groups, and one of the biggest sites, nuclei of organization on the internet has long been Stormfront. Which is it's a place for organizing of neo-Nazi groups, and they have a forum and a search of their forum for psychedelics yielded results that
I mean, I know.
Yeah, go on.
No, please.
Well, ultimately, the idea is that there's a lively discussion in the Stormfront forums about psychedelics, and so we document some of that in the paper.
I think it's worth reading the quote by the user who
read it,
who posted, "I wonder what a LSD does to racial awareness. People who use it talk about feeling more connected, but how does that translate to racial awareness? Does anyone have any observations about this?" And he has his location as the embassy of the Fourth Reich in Finland. I also want to point out the Atomwaffen quote too, where I don't know his first name, but Thomas Berg from Atomwaffen said that there's nothing more Aryan than entheogenic drug use.
Right. So, there's a number of sort of contemporary things that we get into. We get into things that we've sort of covered in previous symposia reporting, but the idea of this paper is to pull all of these receipts together and put them in conversation while sort of showing all of the connections to sort of the broader right-wing movements, but also how is that situated with regard to the claims being made by psychedelic researchers today? And I mean, interest. Please go on.
There you go.
You go. No, you go.
Well, I was just going to say that, we a lot of this actually dovetails and culminates with the January 6th protests and the Q phenomenon. And I think currently there are still people hanging out in Houston waiting for JFK Jr., who's been dead for many years now, to reappear and announce that he's like the running mate of Donald Trump. But Q and the Q phenomenon as a movement has its own psychedelic themes, using like the hashtags of follow the white rabbit, talking about extracting adrenochrome from children's brains to use by rich elites to get themselves high. Like, these are very weird but psychedelic narratives,
And
Neşe,
in kind of the phylogeny of Q. Goes back to 8chan, which goes back to Frederick Brennan, who conceived of 8chan on
mushrooms.
On mushrooms.
Neşe.
Yeah, well, I don't know if this is skipping ahead too much, but we were talking about how in 2021, the non-specific amplifier nature of psychedelics should be more kind of widely known or factor into these conversations. But one of the things that I thought was really interesting was that like a lot of the purported like qualities of the psychedelic experience that are used to explain why it leads to pro-social, liberal, pro-environmental directions are themselves in isolation from psychedelics able to go in authoritarian or other right-wing directions. Because in the paper, I cite the examples of gratitude, is like a common thing that's described, people describe coming across in psychedelic experience, and because people are grateful, they want to, care for society more, etc. But I cite a paper by Tong and colleagues talking about they had people grind up worms in a grinder, and when they were primed to feel gratitude by the investigators ahead of time, those people were more kind of enthusiastic about their worm grinding and following directions than the people who hadn't been primed to feel gratitude ahead of time. And there's another paper that I cite talking about mindfulness, and it noted that people who were practicing mindfulness, kind of like attention, who were primed to think of themselves independently as opposed to interdependently, had a decrease in prosocial behaviors after that. So it's these things that are often taken in abstract and used to justify the kind of logic of, oh, this will make the world better. Even those ingredients of the experience can go in authoritarian direction. So I just thought that was important to point out.
Yeah, and we spend a good deal of time sort of ruminating on what it means for psychedelics to increase suggestibility, which was actually a finding of one of the researchers who's asserting that less authoritarianism is going to result. Robin Carhart Harris put out work saying that LSD makes people much more suggestible, and that then points to the fact that like the extra pharmacological setting, both priming beforehand, what is going on during the trip, and then in the post-integration community support period, that all of this can play into whether or not somebody retains their normal beliefs or whether or not they become radicalized.
Yeah, and just for those who hadn't read that study, there are examples like, the investigators telling participants like, oh, your arm is becoming heavy, and then they feel like their arm's heavy, or this water is like unusually refreshing. It's not just regular water, it's like sparkly special water. And then you drink it and wow, this is really impressive water. It's those kinds of things that if you then insert political ideas, people can adopt those due to the suggestion, increased suggestibility.
Well, and for that reason, because we're not just sort of tearing things down, we're also sort of making counter suggestions as to what might explain what we see in psychedelics, because some people do in fact have radical changes in their worldview or their political or spiritual beliefs post psychedelic session. That's easy to find evidence for, but what how we contextualize some of these case studies that we spend a lot of time pulling together and putting into conversation is that there are examples from the radicalization literature that say that just about anything that radically challenges your currently your extant worldview is going to create what they call a cognitive opening, which is an opportunity for a person to change their worldview, and the sort of extra pharmacological support, the community support for radical beliefs can after one of these openings, which can be the death of a loved one by a drone strike, for instance. If the people around you then say, well, the appropriate response is jihad, then yeah, you may go that route.
So I think that's actually a really great topic to save for next week. And let's cut this here. We will pick up in the following week with a discussion of how those openings allow for potential pluripotency and all of that. This is going to be where this paper is just like far too rich to do in one treatment. So by all means, folks, please join us for the next episode when we get into even more of it.
Thanks, Dave.